For those of you who are only joining us today, welcome to the 7th Dr. Jasbir Singh Saini Chair in Sikh Studies Conference. And for those returning for day number 2, welcome back. Yesterday was a great day with amazing panels and panelists, but today I'm equally excited because we'll be hearing from emerging scholars and also community members. With that being said, I'm delighted and honored to be facilitating the first panel for today, Emerging Voices in Sikh Studies. For this first panel, we will hear from Jaskiran Kaur Bhogal and Avneet Singh Hunjan. Our third panelist for today, Dr. Rajiv Singh, who is a psychiatry resident at George Washington University, unfortunately had to drop out because he was called in for emergency backup for a 24-hour call shift today. Unfortunately, residency is controlling in that nature. However, I am still excited for our two panelists. As a quick reminder, although the discussion for this panel will be following both presentations, please feel free to use the Q&A feature throughout the presentations to ask any questions you may have as they cross your mind. Our first panelist, Jaskiran Kaur Bhogal, is a Ph.D. candidate in the anthropology department at the London School of Economics. Her research explores how and why Sikhs in Britain perform their faith in the public sphere, primarily by focusing on education, youth, community, and social groups. She is also a senior research fellow at the Sikh Education Council and is a member of LSE's COVID and Care Research Team and LSE's Religion Scholars Network. Today, she will be presenting The Evolution of the Panth, Sikh History from Sikh Sources. Jaskiran, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Tejpaul, for that really great introduction. So as was mentioned, my name is Jaskiran Kaur. I'm a PhD candidate, very close to submission at the London School of Economics in their anthropology department. So what I'd really like to talk about today is the evolution of the Panth, but taking seriously Sikh history from Sikh sources and the advantage that that can have for us in understanding Sikhs and Sikhi more generally. So as anthropologists, the way that we do our research is to take an emic perspective. And what that means is to understand a community from within and understanding what that community understands from within itself. So using its own vernacular categories, its own vernacular terminologies, and its own vernacular concepts. My thesis focuses primarily on understanding Miri Piri in contemporary Britain through the lens of home and Sikh polity. My research involved an anthropology at home approach, which sometimes people will call native anthropology, but I'm not a big fan of that language. In my thesis, I decided that to really be able to showcase the stories of my interlocutors properly, I needed to take seriously Sikh history, but from Sikh sources and from Sikh authors and Sikhs themselves. So as an anthropologist, I used primary Sikh texts to construct a history of Sikhs from their perspective, rather than from a history that had been imposed upon them. History is important, and I would like to quote now from Pritham Singh and Meena Danda, that history is not simply the past, history is process. To understand history is to understand movement, forward over time, i.e. diachronically, or in time, i.e. synchronically. End quote. Sikhi and the relationship that exists between a Sikh and the Guru is unique and prevalent throughout the whole of Sikh history. As Uberoy describes, Sikhi and Sikh history is a sacred and joint construction of the Guru and the Sikh, and it is not a pragmatic or contingent one. It has a history of freedom and not of determinism. This particular quotation, and the one I read before, reminds me of a question that was asked to Dr. Lou Fenwick in his keynote speech yesterday. The participant asked, can Sikh history be understood without understanding Gurbani? And he eventually came to a quick conclusion on the spot that yes, it can be, but it's a difficult process. I'd kindly like to disagree with that conclusion. And that's because I think that the whole of Sikhi and Sikh history is constructed on the Guru and the Sikh. And if we don't take seriously Gurbani, how can we understand that history? It is a difficult kind of situation to understand what it really means to understand Gurbani. And I think that's probably a paper for another day, but we can definitely address this a little bit later. What I'd like to focus on now is the notion of Panth and what that really means. I have concluded that a Panth not only describes a collective or a brotherhood, but it also describes a transition of responsibility to the Khalsa Commonwealth, which gives birth to a new form of democracy, or the Sikh way. And if we look at the etymology of the word Panth, it literally translates to the Sikh way rather than as a collective. This is really crucial for our understanding of Sikhs and Sikhi, and particularly their lived experience of Sikhi, because it instills Sikhi as a praxis and not a practice. By that, I mean that Sikhi is not a series of beliefs, it's something that people do. Both a Sikh and a Khalsa accept Guru Nanak as their teacher, but one of the main differences between them is that a Khalsa is one who commits themselves fully to the Guru and actively takes on that responsibility. 3 years after the passing of Guru Gobind Singh, a poet named Senapat wrote that the Khalsa represents the Guru is in the Khalsa. The creation of the Khalsa Panth is epitomized as the Sikh Revolution. It was the creation of a unit that was independent, free-thinking, and without hierarchy or a worldly allegiance. It was designed to combat oppression universally and not only in the homeland of Punjab. It's crucial for us to consider Panth and to consider it alongside the Guru Granth Sahib, as these together were inaugurated as the eternal Guru, and this marks the end of what we refer to as the Guru period in Sikh history. One of the most crucial findings from the Guru period is to consider that Sikhi originates from Guru Nanak and his divine revelation, which is expanded upon throughout the Guru period. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here because the purpose of my paper is to explore how understanding Sikh history from Sikh sources can really help us to understand the now. So I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I would just like to say that the main intention of Guru Nanak's revelation was to wipe out an association to identity. And by this, I don't mean to wipe out an identity in terms of what us as academics might consider identity politics, but rather the idea of the question, what am I? A mainstream Sikh response, and one that many of my interlocutors gave me, was that we are all one. What does this actually mean? So this is a recognition that we all come from Paramatma, or the divine, and that all of these identities exist in our minds through our own interpretation and construction of the world that we live in. This does not mean that these identities are not important, but it really means that they are a context for understanding, and they're labels that we can mobilize and utilize. As Shackle and Mandare write, this statement not only gave a glimpse of the political implications of Guru Nanak's religious experience vis-a-vis the idea of a religiosity beyond social and cultural boundaries, but also indicated the futility of a way of thinking based on the construction of other in opposition to the self. Exemplified in his own day by the tendency to define oneself as Hindu in opposition to Muslim, and vice versa, the process of othering was fundamentally opposed to Guru Nanak's understanding of oneness, end quote. So for a Sikh, truly being Sikh means giving yourself entirely to the Guru. It is never in relation to anyone or anything else. From this, we conclude that Sikhi is not a religion that is in opposition to Hinduism or Islam. Rather, it is the beginning of a socio-political economic movement with the aim of reconstructing the established norms. Singh and Singh state that Sikhs do not believe in a separation of religion and politics, nor in their conflation. Sikhi is a new praxis that has an idea of spirituality that is both individual and social. For Guru Nanak, the spiritual stood for the divine and not the church. This is the idea that changing the individual can create societal change that can be fostered to create a better environment. And I quote, attempts have been made to split Guru Nanak's doctrine into various strands and to trace their origin to precedent schools of thought. But to understand Guru Nanak fully, we must look at the totality of his tenets and what impact it made on history. In this perspective, we shall see that Guru Nanak is historically the founder of the Sikh faith. His precept was definitely the starting point. In many significant ways, it signaled a new departure in contemporary religious ethos, end quote. The crucial finding from the Guru period of Sikh history is that Guru Nanak was succeeded by 9 human form gurus, and each one was recognized and met as the incarnation of Guru Nanak. This is an important underpinning in Sikh philosophy, which can often get missed from when not taking an emic perspective. Ultimately, this means that Guru Nanak is one guru, and so is the lineage that follows. Guru Nanak was a revolutionary who went against the norm and stood up for social justice. This was not common behavior in the 15th century. Janam Sakhis, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, are commonly used to understand and contextualize the Guru. One of the most important Janam Sakhis is to consider the origin of the Sikh institution of Langar, which is known as Sacha Sauda, or the true transaction. I'm not going to go through the Janam Sakhi now because I'm sure all of us are quite familiar, but we can pick it up in the Q&A if anyone has anything they'd like to follow up on. What I'd like to say is that Ultimately, from this Janam Sakhi, we can determine that Guru Nanak believed that investing in people was an investment into society which transcended any kind of monetary transaction. This was an idea that was echoed throughout Guru Nanak's travels in his encouragement of Sangat, including Pangat, and also the installation of dharamsals, which later became Gurdwaras. Each of these concepts were crucial in dismantling the social order through radical social reform and the reclamation of social identity and interaction. He showed how one can live in the world whilst also staying connected to the divine, laying the foundation for the concept of Miri Piri, which was later formally instituted into Sikhi. I'd like to just take a short example now of the institution of Langar and just describe it in the context of my interlocutors and how we understand Langar today as a Sikh diaspora in Britain. So the institution of Langar is a key institution that helps in the practice of Miri Piri. It is an essential part of the functionality of a Gurdwara. At the most basic level, Langar is about the provision of food. However, it also enables spiritual connection, whilst also the opportunity to partake in temporal activities through cooking, cleaning, serving, and sharing food together. Food is a basic component of social life and can be used as an indicator of social differentiation through social hierarchy constructs such as class, caste, status, and power. Commensality has been studied widely by anthropologists as a mean of gaining insight into one's interlocutors. Eating is fundamentally an act of the incorporation of otherness, and eating together is a symbolic act that serves as a metaphor of the collective self. Fischler described eating as we send food across the frontier between the world and the self, between the outside and inside of our body. This is crucial for the understanding of Langar, not only as a practice of shared eating, but also as an institution that requires the breaking down of social hierarchy, particularly in relation to the importance of food in South Asian ideas of caste. Langar has 4 key elements. Firstly, it gives us a secular dimension to Sangat. Secondly, it adds to the functionality of a Sikh group or community. Thirdly, it translates the fundamental principle of equality into practice because of its obligation of all people, regardless of status or any other defining features. They sit on the ground and eat together through the institution of Pangat. Fourthly and finally, it also acts as a cementing force among the followers of the Sikh faith. Guru Nanak attached vast importance to Langar as it became a significant step towards social reform. It was an important rejection of a hierarchy and a hierarchical social ideology by promoting egalitarianism, community service, unity, and belonging. This is essential when we consider how Langar is practiced today. So from institutions and organizations who take Langar out into the community beyond the Gurdwara. It enables us to take seriously what Langar might actually mean and what does it do for our communities. When Langar is taken out into the community, it places emphasis on the free nature of the food and the free kitchen and the serving of food rather than this total institution that has participants that take place from the beginning to the end. For me, this is something that I think needs further study in all disciplines, including Sikh studies, anthropology, sociology, and those that really take seriously the lived experiences of Sikhs. This is further extended because food plays an important role in religious life through the creation of boundaries as to who shares food and who does not. The Eucharist determines who is determined as part of the community by those who are considered as followers of Jesus Christ, whereas the Langar extends the community of those that share food beyond those that identify as Sikh, reflecting the fundamental Sikh ethos of oneness previously described, and extended forms of what I call religio-kin politics. The institution of Langar comprising of preparing, sharing, and the provision of food, and an important and necessary commodity, because sharing food can symbolize oneness, which is a sentiment continually expressed by my interlocutors. The provision of this food is free to all, regardless of whether they associate with being Sikh or not. In the Gurdwara, rather than serving of food or giving of food being emphasized, it's on sharing and community, which is seen through the partaking in Langar Seva by all members of the community and sometimes by non-Sikh visitors. Langar is an important act of seva and a declaration of openness, and it continues to reform society through its availability and accessibility to anyone. but I'm concerned for its future when we don't take seriously its institutions. This is why I believe it's absolutely fundamentally important to understand Sikh history so that we don't accidentally understand Sikh history from non-Sikh sources to enable us to practice our Sikhi authentically, which is what I argue in my thesis, which hopefully is forthcoming and will be presented very shortly at one of these seminars. The next period of Sikh history that I want to briefly address is the First Sikh Republic under Banda Singh Bahadur. This was a process where rule, statesmanship, and a level of Sikh polity existed. Banda Singh Bahadur appointed a police force, installed a government, levied revenue in the form of the swand, and minted coins. Banda Singh Bahadur's life was dictated by a monolithic event where he met Guru Gobind Singh. Under his leadership, the Khalsa exerted their sovereign authority through governance, and under his leadership, Sikhs were given the freedom to live Sikhi free from state oppression that it had been under for the last 300 years. Sikhs were now the ones that were seen as being the authority to wield such power, and they did so by empowering the people of the nation. After his Shahidi, and without his leadership, Sikhs turned to a quasi-republican tradition of the Panj Pyare for its leadership. Sikhs had become outlaws that were being hunted by the state. This led to the rise of the Sikh Misl period, and also the founding of a Sikh rule or confederacy. This was formed of 12 misls or clans, and the misls also ruled in the name of the Guru and the Khalsa, and any victory they obtained was in the name of the Khalsa. The misls were important because they kept the Sikh Panth organized and helped to spread the message of Sikhi. Khushwant Singh described the system as one that combined freedom of action with discipline of a unified command. It channeled the energies of the fiercely independent Khalsa soldier in the service of a cause he held dear, the expulsion of foreigners from Punjab and the fulfillment of the prophecy of Guru Gobind Singh of the establishment of a Sikh state. In 1762, approximately 300,000 Sikhs were killed as part of Ahmed Shah Abdali's ethnic cleansing of the Sikhs. This was known as the Vada Kalugara or Major Holocaust. Approximately a third of the Sikh population at the time were killed in one day. After this, 3 years later, Sikhs regained control of Lahore and defeated the Afghans. This led to the rise of the Sikh Empire under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was the son of the leader of the Sukar Chakya Misl. When his father died, he became successor at the age of 12 and was known as a great king and leader of the Sikhs that expanded Sikh territory and created alliances, which is known as the Sikh Empire. It's crucial to consider this period of Sikh history because it's a contested period of history. It's contested as considering whether Maharaja Ranjit Singh was a great ruler or a great Sikh ruler. I'd like to believe that he was a great Sikh ruler. And this is because despite political unrest in the Punjab resulting from infighting between the misls, who in fact became united under Ranjit Singh, were empowered through various political positions, including in ministerial or military roles, were able to create a large state with its own administration. Maharaja Ranjit Singh ordered the issue of Sikh coins from Lahore and Amritsar and were presented in the name of Guru Nanak. Ranjit Singh always maintained that he was a humble servant of God, dedicated to the service of the people. By 1820, with the blueprint of the Misl confederacies, the empire of Ranjit Singh stretched from the Sutlej to the Indus. The next period of history was the fall of the Sikh Empire. I'm not going to say much about this period, except to pick on one key figure, Maharani Jind Kaur. This is because she epitomizes the whole of my paper. When we read about her from non-Sikh sources and those who were part of the British Raj, she is notoriously a figure who is contested as promiscuous. She's known as the Messalina of the Punjab, and one who just didn't really take pride in anything other than her appearance. However, if we take seriously Sikh sources from the period of time, we learn that she was a key figure and did everything she could to maintain the Sikh Empire and was actually responsible for the reignition of the flame in her son Maharaja Dalip Singh. This is only known if we take seriously Sikh's own construction of history. Next, we move to the annexation of Punjab, and following the Second Anglo-Sikh War between 1848 and 1849, we saw the annexation of the Punjab. Maharaja Ranjit Singh was made to sign over all of his rights to the British and exiled to Britain. This was an integrationist and symbolically compensatory strategy. This time period was also a revival of Sikhi through the survival of the Sikh way of life. Sikhi had evolved from its origins of a socio-political economic movement into a republic under Banda Singh Bahadur, distinct from other competing forms of power. The Sikh Empire, under Maharaja Ranjit Singh, developed into an authority with a Sikh ethos, yet it encapsulated a secular darbar. Following the fall of the Sikh Empire and resulting annexation of Punjab, Sikhs believed that they lacked the leadership that they had become accustomed to. The reform period emerged as one that reignited the sovereignty that came from the Guru Granth Sahib and the Sikh Panth. As Singh and Shani argue, the logic and articulation of Sikh identity itself may have been altered in the colonial period, and as Mandare notes, but Sikhi itself cannot be reduced to colonial construction or a product of elite manipulation by the Singh Sabhas. This quotation itself brings to the fore exactly why it's important to understand a construction of Sikh history from Sikhs themselves, to not only mark their identities and their communities through the lenses of others, but also from theirs themselves, and to take seriously how they have been constructed as a people and how they have become to be understood now. The next key moments were the Green Revolution, and all I'd like to say on this is to quote Shiva, who argues that religious resurgence of the Sikhs that took place in the early 1980s was an expression for a search of identity in an ethical and cultural vacuum that had been created by destroying all value except that which serves the marketplace. This signifies the Green Revolution as an economic project and one that continues as a legacy today, and we can see that from the Kisan movement in Delhi. Moving to June 1984, which was a culmination of all of these events, and Operation Blue Star and Operation Woodrose, which again, I'm not going to say too much about here, and November 1984. Survivors of these attacks described the sexual violence that targeted Sikh women, with men and children primarily being tortured and killed, which demonstrated an agenda to wipe out the Sikh nation. Many Sikhs refer to the events of 1984 as the Third Galukara, or the Third Sikh Holocaust. Tatla shows how the Sikh community's psyche was shattered by the resulting trauma, how it reacted initially in anger and eventually with remorse and extended mourning, which for many continues unabated. The impact of the events of 1984 are still prominent for Sikhs today, as many of them have either been directly or indirectly affected, something I saw myself from talking with my interlocutors in the West Midlands in Britain. Many of these Sikhs were personally subjected to, witnessed, or heard stories about the attacks, and so they continue to live with this trauma today, which is now discussed through collective suffering and collective trauma and mental health debates. These events also sparked a wave of migration, resulting in Sikh diasporas coming to terms with the effects of such an attack on one's population. And just to conclude, Sikhs in Britain in the 21st century, something I have described as a spectrum of Sikhs. The narrative surrounding Sikhs in the diaspora, and particularly in Britain, has become dominated by the discourse of a supposed Sikh radicalization. As Jasbir Singh writes, Sikh activism in Britain changed after the events of 1984. Sikhi became reinvigorated in a way that is similar to the effects of other key moments from Sikh history, such as the Missile Confederacies and the reform movements. The events of 1984 triggered Sikh activists in the diaspora to take action as a result of the seeming threat to the Sikh homeland, and even more importantly, the Sikh way of life. Understanding Sikhi and how it is defined in terms of the lived experience of Sikhs is vital, as it allows us to see just how intertwined Sikhi is with experiencing life. As Uberoy succinctly describes, and I quote, "As we have defined it, it is a form of the non-dualism of self, the world and the other, and it must be expressed in the common morality of religion, family, economics, and politics," end quote. Panth and the Sikh way of life, following in the footsteps of the Guru, is fundamental for understanding Sikhs and how the Sikh diaspora operates outside of its homeland. The rise of Sikh nationalism is a culmination of history. Therefore, and I quote, "Sikh nationalism cannot be seen merely as a derivative discourse, but as a modern instantiation of the Khalsa Panth, a religio-political community, which has its origins in the teachings of the Guru, the Gurmukhi script, and the Panjabi language, and its political foundations in the establishment of the Khalsa," end quote. As a result of the development of Sikh history and the continuous juxtaposition of Sikhs to the power structure, there has been a resulting multiplicity of identities, leading to a spectrum of Sikhs throughout the evolution of the Sikh Panth. Thank you all so much for listening to my paper, and I'd like to apologise for my fumbling. I had my COVID vaccination yesterday and I'm a little bit out of it, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaskiran. And just another quick reminder that we will have the Q&A after after the next presentation, but please feel free to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions you may have had for Jaskiran. To ensure that we have adequate amount of time for the Q&A discussion, I'll just go ahead and introduce our next panelist, Avneet Singh Hunjan. He is a second-year postgraduate researcher at the University of Wolverhampton, exploring alcohol abuse in the Panjabi Sikh community. Following his undergraduate degree at Birmingham, he arrived at Wolverhampton, where he began work on the current topic during his MSc. Avneet's current research builds on this and seeks to explore the influence of religion, culture, and gender on this phenomenon. He will be presenting alcohol abuse, gender, and the Punjabi community. Avneet, the virtual podium is yours.
Okay, yeah. Everything's okay, yeah? So I just want to start off by saying, yeah, thank you. Just want to start off by saying thank you to Professor Pashwar Singh for inviting me and hosting this conference, and of course to everybody who's involved in the setting up of this conference. I also want to say a big thank you to my supervisor, Dr. Pinzajit, for her continued support so that I could be here today to share my research with you all. So, yeah, the issue I want to talk to you about is a topic that's very relevant in the fields of public health, very relevant in medicine, social care, psychology, and other allied health fields. But for me, this is an issue that is becoming increasingly relevant for Sikh studies as well, and that is alcohol and the role that alcohol plays in the Punjabi Sikh community and the relationship that the Punjabi Sikh community has with alcohol. And these are just some of the things that I want to touch on upon today. So the first thing I want to do is give a bit of an introduction and a bit of context as to how alcohol is being positioned within the Punjabi Sikh community, especially in the media. And this is an article that was published in 2017 by the BBC, highlighting that many Punjabi Sikh women felt there's a community harbored stigma that's preventing them from accessing alcohol recovery services. And I really want to put emphasis on this, the fact that it's on women, and I'll show you why later. But this was significant because it was one of the first publications by a major news outlet, especially in the UK, to really shed light on alcohol, and particularly in the context of the Punjabi Sikh community. This was followed the next year by another article. This time was focusing on the UK Punjabi community as a whole, but the majority of the British Punjabi community is actually British Punjabi Sikh. So what the BBC did was, as part of this report, they commissioned a survey of over 1,000 Sikhs, and what they found was, of the 1,000 Sikhs, some 27% reported that somebody in their family had an alcohol or drinking related problem. So if we consider that 1,000 to be a representative sample of the British Sikh population in any way, shape or form, that's a significant concern, a quarter. And other themes that were apparent from this research were that Punjabi Sikh respondents felt that stigma was a big issue in the community. They also felt that they wouldn't know where to go to seek help for alcohol, whether it was for themselves or somebody else in their family. And they generally felt that Punjabi culture in particular is very tolerant of alcohol abuse. And I really want to hone in on this one term that the article uses. It says, alcohol abuse is an open secret. For me, that's very, very interesting, because an open secret implies that it's something that we within the community know about, yet on the surface, everybody else doesn't seem to know. And yet our community, we're not talking about this as much as we should be. But what this demonstrates is that in very recent years, alcohol and Punjabi Sikhs, this phenomenon is gaining traction in the media. It's becoming more and more visible. And particularly on social media platforms, for example, Twitter, this is now really becoming a very debated and hotly contested issue. And what I would say is that the COVID-19 pandemic has really, really accelerated this discussion, because with the people being confined to home, there is a concern that many Punjabi Sikhs will be now turning to the drink as a way of self-medicating or dealing with frustration. Furthermore, there's also the issue that many Punjabi Sikhs who were hiding their drinking and now they're stuck at home, so they can't go to British pubs, for example, are now going to be forced to reveal their drinking to their family members. So, as I mentioned, the alcohol in the media has been gaining a lot of traction, and this is being largely driven by Punjabi Sikhs who've had that experience of having abused alcohol and that experience of going on the recovery journey. And for many of them, they're still part of that recovery journey. It's a lifetime commitment. And what this led to is the development of recovery organizations and programs that are specifically designed to meet the needs of Punjabi Sikhs in the UK. And I've got two examples I'd like to share with you today. The first is the Sikh Recovery Network, and this is based in the Midlands region here in the UK. And this is one service that aims to provide a specific tailored service to meet the needs of Punjabi Sikhs. Many Punjabi Sikhs don't subscribe to the traditional model that's present in many recovery services in the UK, that often doesn't necessarily appeal to them, or it doesn't offer services in the way they would like it to be delivered. For example, many Punjabi Sikhs would like services to be delivered in Punjabi, or they would like to incorporate Sikhi as part of the recovery service program. The other program I want to share with you is known as the Shanti Project. For anyone who's unaware, Shanti is a Punjabi word meaning to be in a state of calm or relaxation. And this was a recent initiative by another Midlands-based organization known as Aquarius. And this was done in response to two areas that the Aquarius organization identified. The first was that many Punjabi Sikhs were now presenting to the service for alcohol-related problems, the majority of them being men. And secondly was in response to a study they commissioned by Professor Sarah Galvani and colleagues. And this study found that service provision to meet the needs of Punjabi Sikhs, much like the Sikh Recovery Network, was very lacking. So that's a bit of a background in terms of the real world application of alcohol and Punjabi Sikhs. So now I want to talk a bit more about the literature and the state of the academic side of things. Well, one of the first studies to investigate alcohol abuse in Sikhs was a study by Cochrane and Ball in 1990. This was a British study. And what they did was a quantitative survey comparing the drinking patterns, self-reported drinking patterns of South Asian men to Western white men. So South Asian implies that also Hindu men and Muslim men were also included as part of this sample. And actually, this is a bit of a problem, which I'll touch on more in a moment. But what they found was that of this South Asian group, it was the Punjabi Sikh men who were more likely to drink than their South Asian counterparts, and they were also more likely to drink to harmful levels. This was comparable to the levels of Western white men. For me, this is a very landmark study, because it's not necessarily the study itself which is significant, or the conclusions, but it was one of the first studies to really shed light on this issue and to actually attempt to uncover what's happening. So for me, this is a very, very important study in this field. But unfortunately, some 30 years later, the field hasn't really developed. It's still a very small and marginal field, and there is a very lack of pertinent literature that explores alcohol abuse in the Punjabi Sikh community. Now, alcohol abuse in itself is a huge field. There are many, many major journals out there, but in the context of the Punjabi Sikh community, this is a very unique and niche area that in which little work has been done. And what really is telling is that a recent article published just late last year by Tark, Brown and Persky, it's a very recent publication, a rare publication. But what it does is it cites the very same sources, including that 1990 study by Cochrane and Bell, just because there's a lack of modern data available. I would say there's no accurate consensus on drinking levels among Punjabi Sikhs, either in the UK or in any Punjabi Sikh community right now. There's no accurate data on the numbers presenting to alcohol recovery services or to hospitals for liver-related admissions, for example. And what this means is, just as I'm doing, and this study does, I expect that many more studies will emerge, citing just the lack of literature as a key rationale for continuing research in this area. But in terms of what literature does exist, the majority of the debate has centered around this idea of whether culture and religion give completely differing messages when it comes to alcohol. So as I'm sure we all know, both Punjabi and Sikh are both independent terms in their own right. You can identify with one without necessarily identifying with the other. And to identify with one does not necessarily imply the other either. But the debate is about whether culture and religion give diametrically opposing messages about alcohol. So the concept is essentially that Sikhi is explicitly forbidding alcohol consumption in any way, shape, or form. And this is in direct opposition to Punjabi culture, which may tolerate or even promote alcohol consumption, especially through media such as Bhangra, in which you can find many lyrics referencing alcohol consumption. And this has been a key debate. Unfortunately, and possibly inevitably, no resolution has been achieved regarding this dichotomy. But the one thing I want to add today, and a new dimension to this debate, is gender, because this is something that hasn't been explored fully as to date. And this is because traditionally research has focused on male experiences of alcohol abuse. So the majority of research has analyzed alcohol as a core component of masculine ideals and masculinity in general amongst Punjabi Sikh men. Women, on the other hand, are often included in research in support roles or as caregivers to either a male partner or a family member who themselves abuses alcohol. And the paper I cite here by Ahuja Orford and Capello is a prime example of this, because, and by the way, this was done in Wolverhampton, which makes it more interesting to me as my research is originating from Wolverhampton. But what the authors did was they interviewed Punjabi Sikh families based in Wolverhampton, and they interviewed husbands, wives, and daughters. Interestingly, they didn't interview any sons, but the questions posed to the husbands were completely different to the questions posed to the wives and the daughters. So the husbands were asked questions about their own drinking, how they perceived their drinking to impact the family dynamic, and whether they felt that their drinking levels could be considered normal. In contrast, the women were asked questions regarding how their husband's drinking had affected them, and the emphasis was very much on what coping strategies they had developed in order to continue on with their lives while living with a male abusive partner. Now, this research is actually in itself very valuable, because this dynamic does exist where the husband is an alcohol abuser. But what this means in the larger picture is that women's experiences with alcohol are much less well understood. But there are suggestions that gendered patterns of drinking do exist, and these gendered patterns suggest that for men, it's more socially acceptable or even expected that they should drink more in public, and it's acceptable for them to be seen drinking at public, especially in events such as weddings and birthday parties and other such functions. For women, on the other hand, the gendered pattern suggests that they are expected to either hide their drinking or abstain completely. And this is important especially from a public health perspective, because hiding your drinking is a barrier to accessing recovery services. And what this means is that many women will, in public events, will resort to measures such as disguising alcohol in soft drinks, so that finding a way for them to still drink, but without openly revealing it to others. And so why is this important? And effectively the underpinning of my research is because for an alcohol recovery service to design effective interventions, we need to understand the theoretical mechanisms that underpin these phenomena. And my research, I would say, is one of the first that does a direct comparison between the experiences of men and women. There are a few that have looked at the experiences of women in recent times, and I would definitely say that there is a shift towards this trend now, where we will see more women coming forward and presenting their own research based on their own experiences. But what we want to know on the basis of this study is, how do Punjabi Sikh men and women negotiate cultural and religious pressures when it comes to drinking? So in other words, how do men and women interpret the messages that they perceive to be given to them by religion and culture? And if indeed these are opposing messages, how do they negotiate them? We also want to look at what are the messages that they receive from the wider community. And this is important because depending on whether these gendered patterns of drinking do exist, does that mean then that the barriers to accessing health recovery services are also different? And to give an example of what I mean by this, if Punjabi Sikh men are expected or feel that they are expected to drink more, does that mean then that it's more socially acceptable for them to present to an alcohol recovery service? Well, perhaps, but it could also be the case that by presenting to an alcohol recovery service, the Punjabi Sikh man is admitting that he couldn't live up to his masculine ideals that he's expected to conform to. Or it could be that it's an admission that, unlike his peers, he can't handle his drink, to give an example. On the other hand, for Punjabi Sikh women, is it the case that presenting to an alcohol recovery service is an admission that she could not maintain her feminine expectations, particularly to abstain from alcohol? And this is important because if women are traditionally seen as custodians of the family honor, they may be discouraged by families to access recovery services, because if the wider community finds out, this could potentially jeopardize the family legacy. I'm sure we're all aware of the concept of izzat in maintaining family honor amongst the Punjabi Sikh community. So unfortunately, I haven't got any data to give you today. I just began data collection late last month. Hopefully I will have something to present to you in the near future, but we can definitely talk about the way we're going about this. And a chosen tool of data collection and the underpinning methodology is constructivist grounded theory based on the framework of Kathy Sharmas. And the reason why we chose grounded theory is because in a field where there's already such a lack of theory that's out there, grounded theory allows me to explore emerging concepts and generate new leads. And the constructivist turn in particular allows me to acknowledge my own impact, being a Punjabi Sikh, but also being a co-constructor of data with participants. Of course, coming into this study, I have my own set of assumptions, experiences, and biases. But also, in many ways, that acknowledging my position also places me outside of this group because I am a male, so I do not necessarily relate to female experiences of alcohol. And furthermore, I haven't had the experience of alcohol abuse myself. So this also places me outside the group. And yeah, as I said, data collection is currently ongoing. We're looking at doing semi-structured interviews, which we will refine as the data and emerging concepts begin to develop. Okay, so So finally, I just want to talk about a bit about what I hope to do with this research, because this for me is not the type of research that I just want to do and then shelve. It's pragmatic, it's all about application. And the first thing I would like to do is to present findings in the form of recommendations to enhance the policy and practice of health and recovery services. I talked earlier about Aquarius and the Shanti project that they launched. Well, one of the outcomes of that project was that they produced this policy document, and this document makes a number of recommendations for how alcohol recovery services can better engage the Punjabi Sikh community and make it more accessible to. The second thing I'd like to do is to open up new lines of inquiry in this field. And the final thing, amongst others, is that I would like to engage the Punjabi Sikh and wider community to raise awareness and encourage dialogue. And this for me is absolutely huge because, in my opinion, we just don't talk about alcohol enough, let alone alcohol abuse. It has become a very taboo subject in the Punjabi Sikh community. And until we begin to talk about it more, we will not begin to address the problems. So that brings me to the end of my talk. But before I finish, I just want to leave you with one last metaphor. We all know that Punjab is the land of the five rivers. But if we consider the state of alcohol in the Punjab itself region of Punjab itself, and also in the wider diaspora, and that is across the UK and Canada and the USA too, one question that must be asked: has alcohol become the sixth? Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Avneet, for your presentation on a very under-researched topic within the Punjabi Sikh community. And now I want to open up for a Q&A, but first thing I wanted to do was, if we had this conference in person, panelists would have had the opportunity to chat with one another during break, lunch, or the reception. But since we are unable to do so this year, I wanted to actually invite Dr. Lou Fennick, who gave the second keynote yesterday, to join the panel, because in Jaskiran's presentation, she addressed something that Lou had spoken to when he very hesitantly said that you can study Sikh history without understanding Gurbani, whereas Jaskiran respectfully disagreed. So I would like to now just invite Dr. Lou Fennick so they can have a very quick conversation about this. And I'm hoping this would stimulate some dialogue that may be helpful to conference panelists and attendees. So I'd like to just invite those two to kind of just have this dialogue and just talk about Gurbani and Sikh history.
Hey, hi everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Hey, would you like me to begin, or would someone else like to begin?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can, we heard what you had to say first last night, and then
Perfect.
we had to hear what Jaskiran had to say just earlier today. So, what are your thoughts on, what Jaskiran had to say? I know you very hesitantly said that, someone can understand Sikh history, but as Jaskiran mentioned, it was very quick at the same time, but I mean, it was because it was a Q&A and you kind of couldn't just take your time as well. So, well,
it was tentative. First of all, let me say, just kidding. That was great, man. I mean, your talk was giving me goose pimples. It was just excellent, and I really look forward to your future work very, very much. And if there's anything I can do, send me a shout. And I'm still hesitant about that topic, about that answer, because of course it's going to take a lot of thinking on my part to work that out. And let me explain. And just kidding, if I have in any way misunderstood where you were going with this paper, please excuse me. So let me give you a couple of my thoughts in regard to I guess the construction of Sikh history from Sikh sources. I certainly understand that Sikh sources form the basis of so much of Sikh, I guess, for lack of a better word, memorial history. I'm, again, trying not to use understandings of tradition and of critical history. I think there's a huge problem in using those two terms for many of the reasons I hope I made clear in my talk yesterday. And that is that, you know, we are, again, crudely put, slaves to these traces, to these artifacts, let's say, whether they are, whatever they are, textual, songs, right? Which are highly, highly selective. So we will never really know. And this is why history is not the past. The past is gone. It can never come back. History is the writing of that past. And that is something that will always be fluid. And so just because our interpretations differ doesn't mean in any way that one is right and one is wrong. And this is something I consistently talk about, you know, and I often tell my students, one of the most disingenuous questions to pose is, what is history? This is the totally wrong question to pose. The proper question to pose is, who is history for? Okay. And that, I think, really gives us an understanding of why history is alive, why history is not a fixed thing. It's constant, it's fluid, it is kaleidoscopic, if you will. So the reason why I was hesitant in answering that question, and again, I still am, you know, and I feel so wishy-washy and sit on the fancy at the moment, is because I'm pretty familiar with the Persian and the Brajbasha and Panjabi material from that period. And indeed, all one has to do is look at the Rehit, right? The Rehitname, which are being produced in that period, which are consistently telling us this is how Sikhs should act vis-a-vis one another, right? This is how Sikhs should act. You know, the Guru Granth Sahib clearly tells us this is what Sikhs are meant to believe, right? The Rehit tells us this is what Sikhs are meant to do. And the fact that they are these Rehit texts are consistently making the issue of instructing Sikhs what to do, and I'm speaking here, of course, of the 18th century Rehitname, indicates to me that there are a number of Sikhs who are not acting in such a way as to align their actions with the Bani of our Gurus, right? And one of the things I write about in my scholarship is that many of the Misaldars in particular, not all of them, but many of them were motivated not only by Bani, right? And it's clear that Rehitnama, if we take account of Purnamatavan's work, it's clear that the Rehitname are there, right, to try and restrain some of the more restive acts on the part of the Misaldars, right? To sort of reel them back into aligning themselves and their behavior with Bani as these Rehitname authors understood it. And again, this is why I'm hesitant, because these sources suggest, I'm trying to be very careful with my words, my friends, these sources suggest that not all Sikhs were acting in accord with the Bani of the Gurus. And this, therefore, by extension, suggests to me that we need more than Gurbani to understand at least this period of Sikh history. Right? Now, of course, Sikh history or the Sikh past extends over well over 500 years now, right? And in that time, there have been millions upon millions of Sikhs who identify as Sikh. However, one would identify as Sikh in the period before the 19th century. So that's why I'm very hesitant. I'm trying to think, why do human beings act the way they do? And that's causing me, causing the hesitation you can easily see in my demeanor at the moment. So that's why I was hesitant there. But otherwise, I totally and utterly agree with you that in order to understand Sikh history, we need to understand these sources. We need to understand these authors. We need to understand the contexts in which they're writing, because context to historians such as myself matter a great deal. So that's my little comment. I agree, and I'm really glad you pointed that out, because I deserve to be taken to task for those for that hesitancy. But I mean, it is honest. I still haven't come to a firm conclusion, but a tentative one. And again, I really look forward to your work in the future. Thank you. Bus ho gaya.
Thanks so much, Dr. Fennick. Tejpaul, is it cool if I jump in at this point? Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much, firstly, for your wonderful comments at the beginning. I'm hoping my work will contribute greatly to the understanding of Sikhs primarily as an anthropologist. And I totally see what you're saying, and I partially agree with kind of the conclusion you've come to. But for me, to fundamentally understand how Sikhi evolved from Guru Nanak to today, to 2021, it's impossible without the framework and lens of Gurbani, because that is for us Guru now. So whilst I totally agree from a historical perspective that to understand specific periods of time in history, we need to understand that specific period of time based on a numerous, amount of sources and accounts and so on and so forth to gain that picture. As an anthropologist, that's not what I do, right? Like I work in the current, I work in the now. So I did field work for 13 months, ethnographic field work for 13 months with my interlocutors in the West Midlands, where I lived with them and literally wrote their history. So that was my construction of that time. And I write my positionality very clearly into my thesis. But I suppose for me, the only thing I disagree with you on is the fact that, and this is why I find it really crucial as an anthropologist of home, that we take that starting point of what Gurbani and what the Guru is, because Sikhi and the evolution of Sikhi is fundamentally that relationship between the Sikh and Guru. So I just don't think it's possible to gain that picture of any of what Sikhi is without that fundamental kind of starting point. But where I kind of mentioned in my talk about, but what does it actually mean to understand Gurbani is a whole other conversation, because a lot of Sikhs themselves don't engage in discourse with the Guru Granth Sahib, for example. We might read or listen or take it in, but not actually try to critically understand what we're reading and what that means to us. That doesn't mean to critique the Guru, by the way. That means to have our interpretation and engage in Sangat and critically discourse with those around us, exactly like we do at these kinds of conferences, which is fundamentally for me the crux of Sikhi, and one of the reasons why I sit in academia, because it allows me to do both of those things simultaneously. So I fully agree with your hesitancy, and I still stand by my my point that we must have at least some understanding of Gurbani and the status of it within Sikhi to be able to understand the construction of history and why we are where we are today. So yeah, thank you so much though, Dr. Fenwick, for that. It was really great. And I really enjoyed your talk yesterday. It shed a lot of light, especially at 1 a.m. here in the UK. So
oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, thank you very much. And you know, some of the things you say have really got me thinking as well. And one of the things I'm trying to come to grips with, and I've been trying to come to grips with it for the last 4 or 5 years, is there something that Sikhi or the study of Sikh history can bring to the discipline of history itself? Because our discipline, as I tried to make clear yesterday, is you know, in many ways we are laborers, and we labor within a particular guild, and that guild has rules. And as I said, we push against those rules. And what I'm trying to understand is there something we can see in the study of Bani which will allow us a deeper insight into the construction of history, into the process of history? And this is something, hopefully, you know, I'll be lucky enough to be able to stumble upon something which will let me understand this in a better light.
I'm smiling, Dr. Fenwick, because that's exactly the conclusion of my thesis, but for anthropology. I actually have a whole section in the conclusion that argues for taking seriously the understandings of minority communities, understandings of themselves, to be able to understand our disciplines better. So I don't sit in Sikh studies particularly, I sit in anthropology, and I utilize Sikh studies to contribute to my arguments. But and I'm very respectful of Sikh studies. It's been a wonderful discipline to see grow over the years. But I myself am aligned a lot more with anthropology as a discipline. I was previously an economist, so it's a great way of learning these different disciplines in that approach. But exactly what I argue in the thesis is that if we don't take seriously our interlocutors' emic understandings, we can't even understand our own disciplines, because we take what I call an outside-in approach, where we utilize these frameworks. And it's actually one of the questions, sorry to jump ahead, Tejpaul, but one of the questions from Connor van der Beek is how do I reconcile that historical documents from the late 19th century onwards increasingly work in Western discourses and utilize these terms essentially in a nutshell? And for me, the way that I see that working is that we always take Sikhi and Gurbani and Guru as a starting point, and we work from the inside out. And that's exactly what I do as a researcher. So whilst I might utilize, the Academy's terminology, because I've been trained both at Queen Mary University and the London School of Economics, I'm able to engage in this discourse and dialogue with other scholars and Western academics, because I don't actually see a dichotomy or mutual exclusivity between Sikhi and academia. It gives me the frameworks and tools to be able to describe Sikhi from within and not from the outside, which I think is exactly what you're proposing, Dr. Fenwick, that we can use Sikhi itself and understand it for what it is to better understand our disciplines, which is exactly what I want to do as a researcher, because I'm fundamentally, a Sikh before I'm an anthropologist or an academic. If I ever had to choose, I know exactly which one I would be picking. So yeah, thank you so much for such a great discussion.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you, Tejpaul.
Yeah, I mean, I was just happy to facilitate. And as soon as Jaskiran made the comment, I instantly thought of in-person conferences. This conversation that you two just had would have been lovely to have in person, and it probably would have happened off to the side during lunch, during a break. But I'm glad now the attendees were also able to join in on the conversation. Very quickly, because this is several questions, before we move on to questions for Avneet, I want to stick very quickly, just get in. There's a few questions about the primary the sources. So one is, can you please comment on the primary sources you used? And then similar is from Dr. Tandi was, how do you define Sikh sources used for constructing Sikh history?
Yeah, excellent. I'm sorry, I have to blame COVID brain for this. My vaccine made me stumble when I presented my sources at the beginning. I didn't actually use primary sources. What I did was I used Sikh studies as my primary source. So as an anthropologist, I did a kind of anthropological analysis of Sikh studies authors and Sikh texts themselves. So those that were written, all of these amazing scholars that we have sat in our midst today, and everybody that's been honored, I utilize these texts as a means of constructing Sikh history from these individuals, these authors, but also more broadly as well from Sikhs who discuss their experiences in their history. So I used my interlocutors' experiences of history alongside these texts to construct my understanding of Sikh history, but from a Sikh perspective rather than, say, a historian's perspective. And that's what I meant by taking a primary approach. So I used them as primary texts, although they're not actually primary sources in the historical sense. It was also in response to Dr. Tandi's question, it's also a little bit of a double entendre, because that's part of what I'm questioning is what actually is a Sikh source. So is a Sikh source only someone who, like a Sikh author who's written about Sikhi, anyone who's written about Sikhi, a Sikh author writing about anything? It's kind of questioning that itself as well. So my understanding of it is those that write about Sikhi, but taking Gurbani and the Guru as that kind of initial framework and building out from it. So that's where I see Sikh sources in the sort of interesting title that I chose for my paper.
Thank you, Jaskiran. And now I want to shift it over to Avneet. Avneet, I have a question for you from Connor. It says, in your research, are you looking at culturally specific spaces of drinking or euphemisms for drinking? By this, I mean spaces like the garage or backyard for cooking chicken and drinking beer versus the vegetarian household, or any slang terms for alcohol. You mentioned the Sixth River, but I also once had an uncle refer to whiskey as Amrit and offered me whiskey in the house by asking me Amrit Pina.
So I would say a bit of both, actually, because the first thing was that we're going to go even beyond cultural settings. We're going to look at modern British settings as well, because the one difference between Britain and the Punjab or even India is the presence of British pubs. And for the diaspora coming to the UK, the first generations, when they came, they often would work in the foundries. And after working in the foundries, they would go straight to the British pubs. And this has become now a key part of Punjabi lifestyle. And so for the younger generations now, drinking alcohol is also happening at pubs, but it's also very much, it used to be before this pandemic, part of lifestyle at nightclubs and bars. So we want to talk about all these settings, and it extends just beyond the cultural. In terms of the euphemisms, I think the Amrit one is a very interesting, and it's not something I've heard before, but if something like that comes up in my research, I'd be very interested to explore something like that further. To refer to alcohol as Amrit is something that many would condemn straight away. So to see how that's developed and what mechanisms have led to this, somebody associating Amrit with alcohol, this is definitely something that I would be interested in exploring further.
Thank you. Just to also speak to that, I had also, so Connor mentioned that, but I also had a friend who mentioned to me that there was a whiskey brand that's also, is actually called Amrit, but they said that it was spelled differently. I'm not sure how it was spelled. So something, for you to maybe consider, Avneet. And then also another suggestion from Dr. Malhotra, a suggestion to see the creation of toxic masculinity and its association with alcohol. You may look at popular culture, more specifically songs of artists like Honey Singh, where drinking features so centrally. Of course, I agree that there's a veil on how women relate to alcohol. And then there's another one for you, Avneet, from Satnam Singh, joining us from Denmark. He says, thank you both for two very interesting papers. If we look at the two arguments side by side, alcohol abuse in the Sikh community and understanding Sikh history through Gurbani, then how does one reconcile the fact that Punjabi Sikhs are more prone to substance abuse despite Sikhi prohibiting alcohol? If Gurbani could be used as a source for Sikh history, Wouldn't that imply then that Sikh Punjabis were less prone to alcohol abuse than Punjabi Hindus and Punjabi Muslims? This also includes other social issues such as female infanticide, where Punjabi Sikhs are overrepresented compared to other Punjabi communities, but where we see in historical Sikh documents that there is a major condemnation of such behavior. So whoever wants to take a first stab at it.
What I say in regard to the why alcohol consumption is so prevalent, is because there's just other factors that have, I guess, become more dominant over Sikhi. That's led to people drinking. If you look at Punjab itself, Punjab being such an agricultural region, one of the reasons why people drink so much in the Punjab is as a self-medication mechanism. So after a hard day of work in the farm, going home and bonding with other men, drinking alcohol, and particularly using alcohol as a fortifying drink, that's become very much a part of Punjabi culture. And it goes back to this debate of whether Punjabi culture and Sikh religion are at odds when it comes to alcohol. And certainly one of the things we want to look at is if people feel that one is dominating the other, or for them, they feel that they want to drink maybe for reasons that are not even relevant to Sikh religion at all. This is something that I hope my research can shed some light on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sabnam, for a really great question. I have to say, so I think I probably take a slightly different approach to this than what your question maybe asks. So I wouldn't say that we're constructing Sikh history through Gurbani itself, which is probably where I may have miscommunicated slightly. But what I'm trying to say is that we take Gurbani as the starting point for understanding outwards, because we need to understand people's history and contexts from themselves, which is what we do as anthropologists, right? So that's kind of the aim of my research. Is so there's definitely people from my field work who consumed alcohol, or who did what they themselves called kind of non-Sikh things or bad things. But what I really try to construct in my own work is that we can understand the way that people behave through taking the lens that they use to behave in that way. So, for example, the use of Sikhism by Sikhs themselves is not something that has come from Sikhs. It's come from being taught to speak that way. So one of my interlocutors, a young boy, isn't brought up in Sikhi per se. He's been brought up by Sikh parents, but he isn't brought up in Sikhi. So his construction of what Sikhi is not from a Sikh perspective. It's from his religious education at school, and therefore determines how he talks about Sikhi and what he calls Sikhism, which I take real issue with, because it removes the praxis element of Sikhi. It removes the fact that Sikhi is a verb, not a noun, and constructs an identity around it. And I quoted in my paper from some of the brilliant scholars we heard from yesterday. And that's kind of what I'm trying to say. So it's not to say that we dismiss people's lived experiences. That's exactly what I talk about, and why I call it a spectrum of Sikhs who have what I utilize an anthropologist's term, which is called a multiplicity of identities. And that's exactly what I talk about, because Sikhs in the diaspora construct themselves really differently. And hopefully my research and Avneet's research will speak to each other, because it talks about migration. And I read a paper by some behavioral scientists that talks about the fact that alcohol for new migrants to this country became a mechanism for them just to work longer hours and get work done. And therefore that was what I have argued to some extent, them practicing their version of Muri Buri. It was their interpretation of it, because it allowed them to work and live in this world to then connect to divinity. So that's not necessarily the case, but it's an interpretation that can be taken, because some of those that ended up choosing to drink didn't see it as a choice. And that's exactly kind of why I want to take Gurbani and Guru as the starting point for understanding Sikhs. So I hope that addresses the question slightly.
Thank you both for answering, and great question. but we are wrapping up this panel, and I would like to thank you guys again for your amazing presentations and look forward to seeing what you guys produce in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.